Okay, thank you once again for the introduction and for the organization of this event. So I'm very happy to be here and it's an honor to be invited to give one of the keynotes at CRITIS. So yeah, my name is Alvaro Cardenas. I head the Sci-Fi Security Lab at UC Santa Cruz. And if you might have heard from the news, there were lots of recent fires nearby. Hopefully, well, thankfully, I think everyone is safe. The campus didn't burn down, but I guess that's one of the risks of living in a beautiful campus in the middle of the forest, that you have it's really amazing to visit, and everyone is invited to visit at some point. If you are interested, I'll be happy to show you around some trails. But the problem is, yeah, the risk of fires, especially in California in the last years. But anyway, yeah, I think I'll get started with my technical presentation. So the title of my presentation is A Decade of Research in CPS Security, an Unconsummated Unit between Control Theory and Information Security. So I wanna basically take a look at some of our early attempts to bring these two worlds together, and sort of like where the community is heading as a whole. So before I start, I guess I want to always bring some motivating problems, and to motivate not only the security problems, but also what control systems are. I'm assuming most of the audience here in CRITIS will know this already, but I think, yeah, these examples will still present some useful concepts so that we share the same ideas on control systems. So control systems are generally defined by a set of devices. Like on the right, we have centrifuges, which would be, for example, the system that we want to control. Things like embedded computers called PLCs, or distributed control systems, that are the ones that actually send the control commands to these devices. And on the left-hand side, we have the control room, where there's usually an HMI and an operator looking at the state of the system. So usually the operator will set some preferences, and you would tell the PLC or the controller how they should behave, or how they should control the physical system, in this case, centrifuges. And the PLC will send the actuator commands. So for example, it will tell the motors to spin at 1 kilohertz all the time for the centrifuges. The centrifuges on the other side will have some sensors attached to them, and they will send status report back to the PLC, and the PLC will relay some of these statuses back to the control room, so the operator can see what's happening in the HMI. So I'm sure most of you know what Stuxnet is, but let me show intuitively what it was. It was the first known worm for industrial control systems, and what happened was there was malware in the PLC, so that when even the operator wanted to send the 1 kilohertz control command, the PLC will ignore that configuration, and it would basically send commands to destroy the centrifuges. In this case, like it would rotate the centrifuges, or it would send commands to the motors to rotate at very high frequencies and then very low frequencies, sort of like creating some resonant frequencies, and destroy the centrifuges. In the meantime, the centrifuges were reporting their status, like they were breaking down, asking for help, and the PLC will send back to the control room that there was nothing to see, everything was clear. So that was Stuxnet, which was discovered in 2010, although it started a couple of years before that. One of the other more prominent attacks in control systems, you might remember, are the attacks on the Ukraine power grid in 2 years, 2015 and 2016. One thing that I also wanted to emphasize in the difference between these two attacks is that in 2015, the attacks were launched sort of like with a remote PC connection. So the attackers got access to the computers in the operating room of control systems, and were remotely able to ask for configuration changes. But to show the sophistication that these attacks are having, in 2016, these attacks were helped through a malware called Industroyer, also known as Crash Override, where the attacker didn't need to be present or have this remote connection to the devices, to the PLs, to the PCs. The attacker could be relaxing some island, drinking pina colada, I guess that's the picture, but then the malware would run in the operator's control room, and it would be, for example, opening the circuit breakers, disconnecting generators from or power or substations from the power grid. And nowadays, you've seen several of these attacks. So this is one of the books recounting what happened with the Stuxnet and then Ukraine attacks. But there's many more attacks that are happening, such as Triton, and then this one went to the back. But there's been reports in Germany of an attack that caused problems in manufacturing plants, smart meters attacks, and even like some random attacks of employees getting upset with their company and just misconfiguring the control systems to cause problems. So we are well aware of all these attacks that are happening now. But back in 2007, when we started looking at this problem, it was a little bit harder to convince researchers that control system security was a problem, or CPS security. At the time, the only verified attack to control systems was a 2000 attack on a wastewater control system. I mean, there's been some reported attacks. That there was a book that said that there was like in the 80s, the CIA convinced the Soviet Union to download malware and cause an explosion in Siberia, but that has not been corroborated outside of that book. But yeah, the only attack that we knew was a 2000 attack on a wastewater control system in Australia. It was a man who helped a wastewater system operator get modernized with remote control for their pumps and valves and things like that. And he wanted to be recruited as a permanent operator of the plant, but they didn't hire him. So what he thought it was, okay, and maybe what I'm going to do is start sending, because I helped design the system, I know what are the commands that this distributed control system will respond to. So I will send these fake control commands to pumps and everywhere in the plant, and then they will see, well, the system, they need help to solve it, and then they will call me and hire me. But that didn't work for him. It took several months. I believe it was 3 months, but finally they figured out that the system was not malfunctioning, it was under attack, and they found him and they jailed him for these sewage attacks. And the attack, yeah, it released more than 750 gallons of untreated water in parks, rivers, and hotel grounds, and there was a loss of marine life and public health, with over $200,000 in cleanup and monitoring costs. And yeah, so I think that was where we started. So that was me like 13 years ago, when I used to have hair and I was young and naive. I had just recently joined UC Berkeley as a postdoc. I was working with Sarab, who is the person on the bottom left. He was a student of Shankar Sastry, who's on the bottom right. So Shankar Sastry is a professor of mostly control theory, machine learning, robotics at Berkeley. Sarab was his student, and Shankar was very interested in the security of the control systems. He kept saying that this is the sort of like the future. I was coming a little bit more from security, so I was a little bit skeptical, saying, well, these attacks, do they really happen? And aren't they disconnected from the internet? Are they really gonna be attacked? So, but anyway, so we went asking around and trying to figure out what is the state of the art and what are the problems in this space. And we were talking to various system people. We were talking to various people in security and like faculty in security in conferences or at UC Berkeley. And sort of like the initial response that we got is that, well, what is new in SCADA systems? I guess SCADA was the big word at the time, not so long CPS. or cyber physical systems. I guess the intuition was that there's nothing in terms of new science, there was nothing else to do, right? You just have these security best practices. So you have like you can use key distribution protocols that have already been developed and just apply them to security, and then secure development life cycles for the devices in the network, and then everything will be solved. Like there was no fundamental new problem. And when we were talking with control engineers or control theory professors, and we were discussing so what are the problems that they may have, and they say, well, so my problem is the control system, right? Everything related to computers or hacks, it should be the role of security. And I guess the question was, well, what happens if the attacker has compromised part of the system? So we know that security is not perfect, right? It will have there will always be vulnerabilities somewhere. And if the attacker has compromised one of the essential elements of the control system, let's say the controller or a sensor, what can we do? And I guess when we talk like that to security and saying, well, that's when if the attacker has part of these operational components like a sensor or a PLC, then this is not my job. Is the job of the control engineers, because now the attacker is attacking the physics of the system, right? And people in control were thinking, well, I guess that's similar to safety and fault tolerance. So we don't need to work on that, because this is the same as a sensor failing or a PLC going like it stops responding. So we have some backup mechanisms in that case, and everything will be fine. So I guess then our first approach was to somehow prove that attacks are different from random failures. And we'll get back to that. But one thing that we discovered while also trying to understand the language of these two fields is that they were very different worlds. So control theory in general is very mathematical, very abstract, sort of like ivory tower research. In a way, it's sort of like a branch of applied mathematics, right? And they have their own venues that are very different from security venues like TAC, which is I guess the major journal transaction in automatic control. And information security is more sort of like applied, right? Other than crypto and maybe formal methods, the InfoSec community prides itself in being very hands-on and very solving real world problems. I remember Engin Kirda from Northeastern University. He was one time giving a talk, and then one student asked him, "Oh, but this is all theory. Like, how would you apply to the real world?" And he was like, "Well, I take offense at being called this is just theory. I'm a very hands-on person." So that's sort of like the pride of InfoSec theory. So there were these two different worlds, and trying to bring them together, we started looking at, well, okay, so what are the things that are different, and how can we start defining these systems? So our first, we started publishing some papers, mostly workshop papers. Our first workshop paper was aimed towards a control community, and it was published in the first workshop on cyber physical systems. And our second workshop paper, I guess the same year, it was mostly targeted and with the language targeting as a security community, saying that the security community needs to understand control. And why? Because security is not only about keeping attackers out, it is also about understanding risks. And we made the argument that if an attacker has this partial access to the system, like let's say attack number 1 or attack number 3 in that figure on the right, then the attacker can change the behavior of the system, and then we can see what are the potential effects, right? So we can understand the risks of what would happen. But we also want to mitigate this type of attacks, detect them as well at the process level. So detecting when you're, for example, sending a control command that shouldn't be sent, or when the sensor measurements are sending sensor values that are incorrect, and also responding to these attacks. So we detect them and then respond to all these adversaries that have partial access to our system. And then we said, okay, so these were workshop papers. Now we try to write the more formal papers. And as we said before, one of the problems with control theory is that they were saying that the initial impression was that we have control systems are going to be saved by our theories on safety or robust control systems or fault tolerance control systems. So our first approach was to say, okay, well, let's try to convince the control community that this is different, that attacks again are going to be different from these random nature failures, because the attacker is going to be strategic. And that was a paper we published in Hybrid Systems Computation and Control, or HSCC, in 2009. And our second idea was published in the HSCCS in 2011, which is basically the idea of detecting attacks or intrusion detection systems based on the physical evolution of the system, like the physics of the kinematics or thermodynamic models or whatever it is, making sure that the system is behaving as we know it should behave and not something else. So so the first idea, going into a little bit of a background, was to say, well, let's say secure control is basically different from all these reliability control systems that have existed before. And this is a slide from our HSCC presentation in 2009, saying that control system theory, there's a lot of work on things like robust control theory or fault tolerant control theory or network control theory, but there's not a lot of understanding of that or studies showing that random component failures, which is what is basically driving all these theories around, are very different from malicious attacks. So that was sort of like the main motivation for HSCC. And we applied it into something called network control systems. In the 2000s, in the control community, that was sort of like the big topic. It was a very active research topic, and the idea was that, well, we've been doing control with analog control signals since the 50s, since the 60s, and now with technology, we're doing control over the internet or over network packets, like either TCP/IP or even Ethernet packets. And the question is, how do we do control with these networks that may be lossy? So the control theory community had previous work, and they were showing stability conditions, assuming, for example, random packet losses, or where the losses were not terribly correlated. Mostly they assumed Bernoulli losses, meaning like a packet was lost once in a while, following a Bernoulli probability. There were some correlated losses, like some Markov chains, that if you start a loss now, then it is more likely that the next packet is also going to be lost. So there was a lot of work done in that space, and what our first goal was to show that a strategic attacker that was able to do denial of service attacks will ruin these state-of-the-art network control algorithms, even if the attacker had some constraints in the amount of time that they could launch the attack. But if they could time it properly and have the right duration, they can basically break the previous state-of-the-art in network control systems. And then our goal was to say, well, now that we show that attackers are different than just random failures, because again, attackers are strategic and they know our control systems and they know when they can attack to cause maximum damage, then how do we try to secure them? So that was also part of our work. Our original idea at a high level was that we should predict these DOS attacks will happen at any time. And because of that, we're going to be more conservative in our control. We're going to be sort of like if control allows us to move around in a ball, let's say in a space, we're going to be sort of like closer to the center, so that when the DOS attacks happens, we're not going to be drifting towards unsafe states. The drawback is that our control was more secure, but at the same time, it was more conservative, so it was not, I guess, optimal in some sense. Before we published our paper in Hybrid Systems Computational Control, I remember we tried to submit it to CCS, because we said, well, let's try to see if this can be, so CCS is one of the top security conferences. So HSCC is a control conference on the other hand. So before trying to submit to a control conference, we submitted it to a security conference. And because first, we weren't sure that control theory conferences would be interested in security, but second, we wanted to engage the security community. And yeah, just looking at the reviews for our CCS submission before this presentation, I found out that some interesting observations, like for example, reviewer 4 to CCS said that the paper was quite weak with the bulk of the meat, somewhat cursory treatment of linear control systems. So I think the reviewer was thinking that this is sort of like a trivial thing, but then he goes and says that the paper also refers to esoteric control theory terms like Leuenberger observer gain, second order cone programming problem, and EULA parametrization, without providing the reader any background on them, their meaning and implications. So this adds to the general inapproachability of this paper to most readers. And I guess on hindsight, that was true. So this is, I guess, a slide from our HSCC presentation. So control theory in general, this is sort of like what they expect. And when they go to conferences, sometimes they don't even want the text describing the motivation. They want to see, okay, what is the model? And yeah, maybe this was a little bit too like a very strong departure from security conferences who were more interested in the motivation and sort of like the details of implementations rather than these more convoluted mathematical problems. So that was sort of like our background to control theory for resilient control systems. So the second idea that we were looking at was using the physics to detect attacks. And in here, there's an attacker that somehow is changing the sensor values. So the PLC is not going to close the valve at the right time. It should have closed it before, but it keeps open the valve because it believes it is at a lower level. So this attacker in a way has changed the way the control system behaves, or at least the measurements of the physical evolution of the system. And our idea is that, well, the physics-based, so we can try to do attack detection by monitoring the physics or the physical evolution of the system and saying, well, we have attacks on industrial control systems, will have a direct impact on the process. And even strong attackers are bound by the laws of physics, right? So we know that, for example, that tank is the growth of the water in the tank is going to be defined by the laws of fluid dynamics, and we can create a model and then see if what we see, what we're expecting to see is in fact what we are receiving from the field. And if we get some persistent deviation, then we start getting suspicious and potentially raise an alarm. So this was, I guess, the general architecture for detecting this type of attacks. So on the top, you have the physical process, like let's say the water tank that is under control. And you have actuators like the pump or the valve that put water or remove water from the tank. And you have sensors like the water level sensor that are reporting information back to the controller. So the detection architecture or the attack detection should get information not only from the sensors, so not only from those sensor values YK, but also from the controller, because that it's an integral part of the system, right? So if we ask to open the valve, then we know we're going to be expecting the water to grow. And if we see a control command saying close the valve, then we know that the water either is going to remain the same, or if we see another controller saying open the pump so the water comes out, then we expect the sensors or the water to go down. So, and the reason I'm highlighting that the control system is important, or that the detection needs both sensors and control values, is because yeah, some research later on didn't use the controllers, and we're going to discuss that later. And the idea is that, okay, you detect an attack, and then our original idea in that paper in 2011 was to say, if we detect an attack, what can we do in the sensors? If we detect an attack on the sensors, then our best bet is to say, well, we're going to create, basically run a simulation of the system in parallel and replace the values that we know are compromised with our best guess of what the value is, so that we keep the system operating in hopefully safety conditions before we probably shut it down. And this block here, this detection block usually has two components. So the first one is you get information about the physical model of the system. So this can be, for example, a linear dynamical system, sort of like, or autoregressive model that is sort of like modeling, given the inputs that I'm sending to the controller and the sensor values, what is it that I expect to see from the measurement? So it's sort of like giving you a prediction of what you should be seeing from the field. And then you compare what you see, your expectation, with what you see from the field, and then you keep some sort of statistic of these deviations. And that would be sort of like the anomaly detection part. So we implemented this. These are our slides from the paper presentation in 2011. We implemented this in the Tennessee Eastman process control system, which is it was a testbed used in control systems research, mostly for fault tolerant systems and distributed control systems. The idea was to keep pressure in a chemical reaction below 3,000 kilopascals, but at the same time keep it below 3,000 kilopascals, but keep it also high enough so that the whatever product we were generating was optimized. And we proposed some stealthy attacks. The idea of a stealthy attack is that you have sort of like this bar in red that is sort of like the anomaly detection threshold. You say, well, if our anomalies over time accumulate above that threshold, we're going to raise the alarm, and the attacker is going to try to stay below that threshold. So we launched these 3 different attacks, and we showed that if the attacker doesn't care about being detected, of course, they can create a lot of damage in the system and raise, for example, in this case, the pressure above 3,000 kilopascal, creating some problems. But if the attacker wants to remain undetected, that means if the attacker wants to remain undetected below that threshold, then we actually showed that the system was going to be resilient to the attacks. So it would survive an attacker that it was trying to be stealthy. And even because we proposed this idea of running a simulation, so if we detect an attack, we run a simulation. Our simulation was high fidelity enough that was able to keep the system in a safe state, even if you had a false alarm. But the question is, well, this was in 2011, and so what were we doing since HSCC 2009, or since our last publication in 2009? Well, I guess we were submitting it to other conferences. So we were trying again. So our paper, we originally submitted the paper in control theory to a security conference, and that was rejected in security. So we switched to control, and that was accepted in HSCC. But in this one, we were determined, okay, this one we should submit it to a security conference because we have to bring the other community to this area. So we submitted it first to CCS, again, one of the top security conferences in 2009. And yeah, reviewer 3 was sort of like summarizing what I think the security community felt around that time, what control theory papers were. So the reviewer 3 was saying this paper addresses the wrong audience. This paper is difficult to read for someone without a strong control background. An undergraduate degree with control specialization is insufficient. I believe the paper is more suited to a control conference where its novelty could be assessed more accurately and perhaps appreciated more. So basically the recommendation of reviewer 3 was to submit the paper not to a security conference, but to a control conference. And we said, okay, yeah, we've done this in the past. Let's try again with security. So we submitted again, this time to NDSS, which is another top security conference. And reviewer 3 again didn't like it. So this time it was, I think, one of the problems, in addition to the paper sometimes being too oriented to control, was that reviewers in security, they wanted to see, okay, so what is the real security or the practical security problem? So you say there's an attack on the sensor, but like, how do you launch this attack? Like, was it a buffer overflow, a cross-site scripting attack? Like, what is the specific vulnerability? So they wanted, reviewer 3 in this case, wanted to see like more sort of like tangible, real world implications of how these attacks will happen. And they thought, I guess, the general model of these attacks, if you model them as a control system, was not that interesting. And in fact, that's what he says at the end. He says, it's not very clear to me what the security issue is that is being addressed. So I think for them, for reviewer 3 in this case, the only security was the one with systems security, like the ones dealing with like attacks to the operating system or to attacks to the application or the network, and not this sort of like high level conceptualization of the sensor attacks. So we said, okay, well, we've been rejected twice from good security conferences. So, but I think we have a good idea, and we need to publish it fast, because someone else is going to get this idea and publish it very soon. So we thought, okay, let's go to our safe bet. There is a conference called, or a workshop, New Security Paradigms Workshop, and the call for paper says, NSPW welcomes unconventional and promising approaches, and we're particularly interested in perspectives from outside computer security, encouraging researchers to think outside the box. And we thought, okay, maybe this is the right place to submit a paper with control theory concepts for the security community. Unfortunately, it was also rejected, and I couldn't find the reviews to that one. But I do remember being quite shocked, because I thought at the time, okay, sort of like, it's a workshop, so it's not like, it shouldn't be that competitive. And at the same time, I thought we had the right description, right? It was an approach outside of traditional or conventional security, and giving a security solution for using control theory. So at the time we were kind of demoralized, and we were thinking, oh no, this is never going to be accepted in a security conference. And I think something good happened in 2010. Stuxnet was discovered. And then all of a sudden, everyone was talking about SCADA security. Stuxnet was discovered in June 2010, and then it got more traction in July with a blog by Brian Krebs, and then people started looking more into this and realized it was a malware for security in SCADA systems. And I guess people were more interested in that. I remember working on HSCCS. The submission to that just was the first submission after Stuxnet. So we submitted it, and then we finally got it accepted, with all reviewers saying this is a timely topic. So we finally had it. We had the paper on this. But yeah, so it was I guess I should thank Stuxnet for getting some of this community interested in our approaches. But we were not the only ones working, doing a sort of like early research in control theory, at least for cyber-physical systems. One of the seminal papers around that time, it was originally published in this conference, CCS, in 2009, and then the journal version was published in TSEC in 2011. It's false data injection attacks against state estimation in electric power grids. So that paper, it was only censored. There was no control. So there was no basically an algorithm that took the sensor measurements and then made a control decision out of that. But it's still seminal, because I think it was the first paper articulating how, or convincing, I guess, a security audience that false data injection in cyber physical systems was an important thing. Not only that it bypassed traditional reliability settings, because it bypassed something called false data injection in state estimation. Again, similar with the idea that attackers are strategic. And third, it was very impactful, because I think a lot of people were wondering, okay, so yeah, I guess we're starting to have an idea that false data injection attacks are important, but how do we formulate them? And I think they were the first ones to show a nice formulation and to a real world system. And then there was a lot of follow-up work after this paper was published. But interestingly enough, the paper was published in a security conference, but most of the follow-up work was in control theory conferences and power grid conferences, not so much in security, which was interesting. So I believe the first time I saw a paper formulating control theory problems with integrity attacks or false data injection attacks was a paper by Gillinmo and Bruno Sinopoli in 2010 in a workshop, in the first workshop on secure control systems, false data injection attacks in control systems. And that one was the first one sort of like formulating what we had proposed in our workshop, ideas that false data injection attacks are important and we should study them. And I think they were the first ones to study them in a nice fashion. Our previous paper, for example, in HSCC was dealing with denial of service attacks. So that one was easier in a way, that it was just sort of like strategic jamming. But this one was saying, well, the attacker has control to one of the sensors, let's say, and then how can they lie, and then how can we protect how can we protect the system against that? And in parallel, so these were the ones in red were mostly focusing on linear system, or like sort of like this control, either control theory or control aligned methods like the power system. On the other hand, there was also a lot of security and CPS, starting like, for example, the first paper down here, it's pacemakers and implantable cardiac defibrillators. So there was a lot of interest starting also in implantable medical devices and the security of them, and also, for example, the security of cars, of vehicles. But they were related to CPS security, and it was mostly driven by cybersecurity experts, but not so much, they didn't deal with the control theory part. So I would say that 2010, 2020 was the decade where research in CPS security really expanded. And information security or InfoSec security, like the last two papers I quoted, they had different attacks, mostly like hacks, for example, showing vulnerabilities in real world systems, like hacks to vehicles or hacking medical devices or hacking smart meters and showing they were insecure. There were also some proposals on network security monitoring for control systems. So people were starting to look at what we've already done intrusion detection in classical IT networks. Now let's take a look at the control system networks and expand on that. And then also at the endpoint, providing software assurance or minimizing the kernel. And then in control theory, on the other hand, there was a lot of work also on physics-based attack detection, passive or active meaning with watermarking. So the idea was that we're not only measuring passively and see what's happening in the real world, but we're also going to excite the world as a defense and say, well, we're going to put some noise in the way we actuate, and see if we receive that noise in the sensor measurement as well. So this was the idea also developed by Gillinmo and Bruno Sinopoli at CMU at the time. And then there's also attack resilient estimation, control, consensus algorithms. So there were several control theory groups like Fabio Pasquelati at UC San Diego, and also the group at UCLA, they were working on sort of like resilient estimation, sort of like in a way using error correcting codes to get the right estimation, even if some of the measurements were compromised, and safety, and also some game theoretic analysis of control systems. So the idea that, okay, control systems, the difference again with traditional failures is that there's a strategic adversary. So how can we model the strategic adversary? And I guess the obvious choice is to use game theory. So did security and control theory live happily ever after? And our answer was, so we did sort of like a study in the middle of the decade, a study that was published in CCS 2016 and later in ACM Computing Surveys in 2018. And we were looking at basically everything that, or at least most of the things that we could find at that time in what we would call classical control conferences, security conferences, or power grid conferences, looking at papers that were looking at the physics of the system to detect attacks. And as you can see, for example, control theory papers had their own models. So in physical model, you can see that nice set of what we call linear dynamical systems, LDS, which are basically linear state space models. That's how control theory call them. And you can see like pretty much all the papers that were published in control theory were satisfying that model, because that's basically the standard model that they use. In power systems or papers published in the power grid, it was a linear system again, but it was without, similar to the original paper of Yao Liu in CCS 2016 for the false data injection attacks. They didn't consider the dynamics, so it was sort of like a static system, only sensor measurements, and so all of them were sort of like linear models of that. And you can see, for example, in the red box, security has models all over the place. So some conferences assume some heuristics, some other ones use machine learning, other ones use some autoregressive models. I think, yeah, Shokri, our own work, our own previous work, and yeah, we're the only ones who were using sort of like these traditional control models, but everyone else in security was using their own models. And then there were all different ways, for example, of validating the effectiveness of the system. So, for example, metrics that was consistent across the board. And everyone was proposing their own metrics. So, like for example, in control systems, they would say, well, we can just look at this anomaly statistic, and if we see that the anomaly statistic changes, that's enough. Security, I guess they were more interested in true positive rates, false positive rates, so there were more of that. And then the validation of the method, you can see, for example, in control theory papers, most of it is either simulation or mathematics. There's very little work with real data or test beds, and in security, it was a little bit all over the place, but it was, for example, trying to get more realistic systems. And our observations from these two communities was that, well, the work of people working in security conferences, the good is that they assume the adversary is not the same as faults. So I remember one of the papers by Hadziasmanovic, I'm sorry, Hadziasmanovic, paper 20. So I remember that was published in ACSAC, I believe 2010, no, 2000, I think 2012. It was, they were saying, well, the attacker knows how the system is and might bypass our system. So we're not even going to try to measure false positive rates or launch attacks. What we're going to do is just see, okay, how good our models model the physical system, and that's it. And the other good thing is that the real world systems, they were tackling like realistic systems, right? So the bad is that they, most of the papers published in security conferences ignored control signals as part of anomaly detection. So if you remember, this was the this key part where the detection receives the U command also. So a lot of the papers in security were only getting UI, and they were ignoring that, they were ignoring U. So they were basically saying, we're going to detect anomalies only by looking at the sensor measurements. But our argument is that, well, I mean, that's not good enough, because if you know the inputs, it should give you a better idea of what the output should be. You should, like, just looking at anomalies with the sensors is, I mean, you might be able to detect some anomalies, but you're definitely not doing the best job you can. The other bad thing is that I think the models that they were using for for example, the behavior of the sensor signals were based either on machine learning or some other heuristics, and they ignore the work in control systems identification. So control theory, they have developed some good models of a lot of these systems, and we just need to fit the parameters. And that was something that they were not using. And yeah, another thing is that they only monitor the supervisory network, not the field network. Control theory, on the other hand, the good thing is that the models considered inputs. So they obviously had these inputs and outputs. So they had the U and the Y in the detection community. And the other thing is that they had proofs of the performance of security. The bad is that they rarely implemented solutions in real-world systems, and the metrics of performance were very incomplete. As I was saying before, some of these control papers, they just said, well, look, under attack, the statistic is going to perform different, and that's enough. But they didn't really measure, okay, how good it is against attacks. So yeah, I guess our argument is that real world is more complicated than what can be modeled with proofs, and maybe you can get better performing systems even without the proofs. The other thing is that because in control theory, you want to get proofs, you generally have a very limited adversary, because you want to prove the system, to prove that the system does whatever property you want to have. Then the attacker has to be very limited, and in several of these papers, the attacker was also acting like a fault, so like some random measurement. So yeah, so our goal with our CCS publication at the time was to say, well, let's try to bring the best practices of each field and say what are try to guide control people and also security people sort of to some of these best practices. So the first idea that we had was, okay, all these proposals, everyone has their own metric. Let's try to propose a metric to compare all previous proposals. And let's also try to run this in real world systems and in simulations. The second idea was try to emphasize more system identification from control theory. So try to tell people in security that system identification might be the first, at least the baseline approach that you should try before trying to do, let's say, machine learning. So you have a control system and you have some sensor values. I guess the obvious thing to do is to say, okay, I'm going to run an LSTM deep neural network, and I'm going to learn all the correlations of the Ys, and that's it. But there are several drawbacks to that. First one is, I think maybe even a simpler approach, like the ones used by control theory, might work. And second, you lose a lot of the explainability of the model. Like in control systems, you have these models that show directly how the input is affecting the output. So system identification is basically the machine learning for control systems, and we try to emphasize that. And the other thing is stateful statistical tests in general perform better than stateless tests. So we're gonna talk about this in the next slide. And also the control algorithm, like the control algorithm can also help us design more robust systems. So let's take a quick look at that. So these are the classical models used in control systems. Not all control systems will behave like a linear model, like the first equation, but a large number of them on their, like if they operate close to an operational point, they can be approximated by this. And our argument was that, okay, given these models, we only need, with input and output data, we only need to estimate those matrices, A, B, and C. And that's basically the learning. So given input and output, you can learn A, B, and C and get these models of the system. There are some other models, like for example, if you don't consider the inputs like U, K, you can try to model only Y's, and this is, for example, autoregressive models. And the anomaly can say, if you have an anomaly at any given point and it's given that a threshold, you raise an alarm. Or a stateful test, basically you keep a history of the anomalies, and only until enough evidence is collected that you're under attack will you raise the alert. So just a quick summary. So we implemented these systems in various settings in our paper in 2016. This was in particular in a testbed in Singapore, the SWAT testbed, that we work with them collaboratively to work on this. And well, the obvious thing is to first test that if there's an attack, we will detect it. And yeah, that's easy to detect. If the attack is obvious, we will obviously detect it fast. But if we want to be more cunning than failures, or attackers are going to try to remain below this anomaly detection threshold, right? So like this is, for example, an attack that remains below the threshold, and it manages to deviate the sensor reading significantly from the real water system, the real water level. So our metric to deal with that, with stealthy attackers, was to say, well, we need to have two trade-offs. One is the security metric. So we want to measure the deviation, how much can the attacker deviate the system? In this case, for example, the difference between the blue line and the orange line while being undetected. So how much can the attacker deviate that without being detected per unit of time? And this metric was later extended in a control theory paper in the American Control Conference 2017. And then the usability metric is the expected time between false alarms. So we want to have a long time between false alarms, and at the same time, we want to minimize the deviation that it can have. So our proposed metric for stealthy attacks is the following. So on the y-axis, we have the security metrics. So basically the impact of the undetected attacks, or how much deviation can you get per unit of time between the blue one and the blue line and the orange line. And then on the x-axis, we have the usability metric. So we want to have long time between false alarms. And that way we can compare different anomaly detection tools and different and the performance on the strong attackers. So I remember, I think when we were proposing this metric, several people said, well, what's wrong with ROC curves or like traditional metrics? Why don't we use them? Well, and the problem is that if you have a stealthy attack, by definition, your probability of detection is going to be 0. So the ROC curve for a stealthy attacker model is going to be like a flat curve with 0 detection, because the attacker is always going to bypass the system. Our metric, on the other hand, will say, well, if the attacker wants to remain undetected, so the x-axis is similar, is the probability of false alarms, and because it's a continuous system, we want it to be more specific and say, well, this is the expected time between false alarms. Let's say we get an alarm every minute, or an alarm every hour, or an alarm every day. So I think that's more useful than the probability of false alarm being 0.01, because then you have to say, well, okay, what is the base rate and how many times it takes you longer to get an intuitive idea of how many false alarms you're getting. And the y-axis is, so basically the deviation that you can get. So we try to exemplify this in various systems in our paper in CCS. So for example, on the left-hand side, you have an attack on the pH. This is a part of the water system in Singapore that is controlling the pH level of the water. So it wants to keep the pH between, I guess, 8.1 or 8.2 and 6.5, I forgot. And it wants to keep it around the same level. At some point, you release some chemicals and you keep it oscillating in these two. And if we have an attack on the pH sensor, you can deviate the system enough and stealthy attack. And on the y-axis we have our metric applied to this system. So the sort of like the rate of change of pH per minute that you can inflict over the average over the expected time to false alarms. And that gives us the ability to say, well, for example, in this case, a linear system was pretty useless because even from the beginning, the attacker can deviate the system really fast and cause the pH to become really acidic. And if the pH becomes really acidic, it destroys the membranes of the system, and obviously the water becomes unsafe also to drink and to have. So in this case, the linear system didn't work, but we can start modeling, for example, using nonlinear models, and we go into detail in the paper. I'm not going to give the details here, but we use a nonlinear model of order 50, and that one was better than the linear system, but still not good enough. So we actually were satisfied with a nonlinear model of order 100. And in that case, our nonlinear model was able to match the real system close enough so that a stealthy attacker cannot damage it. Yeah, we also did the same thing for other networks. We also had access to a water distribution system in Dallas, and our goal with this plot was to say a lot of previous work was considering only one input and output in one sensor, but we were saying, well, if we have multiple, like a large system, we have to correlate the inputs and that, or the measurements, and that will improve our detection performance. So that shows we're better. If you have correlated attacks, you get less deviation from the system. And then an interesting observation that we didn't expect when we were running these experiments, that we also found out that the control algorithm can also help us be more resilient to attacks. And this was with simulations. We also ran a power system simulation attack. And in this case, we had an actuator attack. And we had a P control, which stands for proportional, and one PI, which stands for proportional integral. And the interesting part about the integral part is that as long as you're seeing the real world, so in this case, the attack is not a sensor attack, but an actuation attack, the integral part is going to try to fix that error, because it's going to basically accumulate the error and say, well, if whatever control action you're doing is not helping you stabilize the system, I'm going to increase the control action. And if the next time step, I still don't see an update, I'm going to go really, really strong this time. So we found out that, yeah, even the control algorithm can help us be more secure. So so that was our mid-decade review, and we saw several problems. We proposed new directions. So are we better now that we're in 2020, like our information security and control theory finally working hand in hand? And I think it's getting better. I now see that security conferences are more receptive to control theory content. Like I've been reading several papers accepted to top security conferences, and they already dropped things like Kalman filter, or even the extended Kalman filter, which is the nonlinear version, like without even explanation. They say, oh yeah, we use the extended Kalman filter for this, and everyone assumes this is well known. So that's progress, I would say. If I remember, we mentioned the Kalman filter, or even the Leuenberger filter, which is the same thing that the Kalman filter, but without the noise. In our original CCS9 paper in 2009, and reviewers were upset that we were talking about that without giving context. And now I think papers mention this, and they don't get like rejection or reviewers concerned about this. So I think security conferences are getting better at this. and yeah, like we've even had some three recent papers in top security conferences accepted working in reasonably, I would say, reasonable level of control concepts. I'm just gonna give a brief overview because I'm running out of time here, but like one of the fields that has been accepted in security conferences is this idea of attacks to the power grid through the Internet of Things. So the idea is that kind of high wattage IoT botnet. Let's say if an attacker has compromised your washer and your AC, if they have compromised, let's say 1 million of these devices, can it cause a blackout to the system? So this is a paper called Black IoT. It was published in Unix Security in 2018, and then a similar paper was called Grid Shock, which was published in AsiaCCS 2017, and they were saying yes, attacks like these are gonna damage the power grid. Our paper was saying it's probably not as easy as previously thought, and our argument was that these previous papers, Black IoT and Grid Shock, didn't model the security protections of the power grid. So load shedding is one of them, and then just because a line is overloaded doesn't mean it's going to get disconnected. It just sags for a while, and then the protection relay kicks in a while. So we were saying, yes, okay, maybe these attacks are going to have an impact, but probably not a blackout. Definitely not a blackout in the connected system, which is here the transmission side. If there's a blackout, it's going to be in the distribution side, which it's easier to correct, and it's not going to require black start capabilities. We also started working on not only on security but also privacy and the issue of what happens if sensors, if you're protecting a system with privacy, so that you protect the privacy of the consumers giving the data to the control algorithm. The problem is that if you have compromised sensors, then they can lie more without being detected. So this is the main idea of a recent paper that we have in MDSS this year, adversarial classification under differential privacy. And just a quick sample of the last paper we were working on. So basically, this is the same physics-based attack detection system, but for autonomous vehicles. And this was published this year in Unix Security. And I think the interesting part of this is that we're working on it was sort of like a repeat of our 2016 paper, where we have a paper that was published in security before using some heuristics for the models of the systems. In this case, for example, we know the precise model of a drone, and that's what is shown in the bottom left corner of the slide. And so the model is well known. That's how models operate. The only thing that we need to do is estimate the parameters. But once we estimate them, we can implement it in real embedded systems and test when the system is under attack. So I think yeah, we keep working on this physics-based attack detection in other systems, and security conferences keep getting, I guess, in a way, more receptive to these control theory concepts. Like I cannot imagine, for example, this was actually in the paper, that figure in the bottom left with all these equations and differential equations, the derivatives. Like 10 years ago, I think this would have been an automatic rejection in a security conference, but I think nowadays they're getting more accepting to these concepts. And so overall, I believe things are changing, and I expect more interaction between security and control. I think that in the future, there is hope. So I think, yeah, we have an upcoming paper in the IEEE European Symposium on Security and Privacy, which is, I think, is 2 weeks from now, called DARIA, Designing Actuators to Resist Arbitrary Attacks Against Cyberphysical Systems. And I think it's the most theoretical control paper, in a way similar to our original attempt that we submitted in CCS 2008. But this time, surprisingly, we didn't get a negative reviewer. Like all of them were positive. So we were surprised by that. And The paper is dealing with how to design the actuators in control systems so that if one of them is under attack, the reachable set is designed in a way that you cannot reach unsafe states. So, so I think this paper, this upcoming paper, is sort of like shows the promise of control theory, that we can prove things are secure against any attack, as long as in this case, well, as long as it's only one attack, one actuator being under attack. But we don't need to assume any sort of like heuristics of the attack. If it's a replay attack or a scaling attack or a delay attack, or it's like any arbitrary attack. So that's one advantage. And another funny thing is that this is a physical defense to counter cyber attacks. So we can design the actuator physically. Let's say we're gonna, like the pipe that just that lets the water in, we can design it to be fix the rate of the flow of the tank, and then that's something that the cyber attacker cannot compromise. So yeah, to finalize this presentation, so we have some, I believe control theory still has much to offer to CPS security. So although it might give a first impression of control theory is that it's ivory tower research, applied mathematics that doesn't have any connection to reality, there's a lot of practical tools that we can get out of it. However, we need to get, in a way, dirty and implement these control principles in practical real-world systems. And I think that's how we're going to get real work done. Another conclusion that I've been doing since the beginning is that system identification of well-known models should be used before learning models, for example, with neural networks, before you try to learn a neural network model of a system, because again, control people have spent a lot of time building sort of like approximation to differential equations of how systems behave, and so I would say let's give those a try first before trying something more convoluted. And then I think there's various open problems still. So there's obviously the limits of attack detection in CPS. One of the things that we have been working is that we always keep sort of like a window of time for detecting the attack. But I guess one particular thing, especially if we want to recover from attacks, is that can we keep different time histories and try to create different versions of what happens depending on when you think the attack has started. I guess the bigger question is how do you recover from attack? So there's been a lot of work on detecting attacks, but the question is how do you respond? So there's been some work on responding, and like one of them is either through sensor fusion, trying to figure out how to replace the compromised measurement with some redundancy that is out there, or like simulating the model. Like if we know how the system behaves, you can simulate it and in a way running in open loop. But I think those are still very preliminary work, and to provide a nice recovery strategy is still an open problem. And resilient control still has many open problems. So we know how to survive some attacks, but there's always a lot of assumptions, right? So like for example, in our latest paper, you only assume only one actuator is compromised. But how can we make this more general? So yeah, with that, I think I would like to thank everyone for this opportunity, and I'm open to questions if there's any from the audience or from the other organizers.